have found yourself on the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I am Dr. Nerida, and today I'm doing something a little bit different. We had one of our listeners, Esther, left us a comment on one of our Q&A episodes asking us if we would please touch on what to feed and what to avoid feeding a Marey mare in one of our Q&A sessions. And I got to thinking that's a whole topic in itself. So that's what we're going to cover today. What do we feed Marey mares and what should we avoid feeding Marey mares? I sat down to plan this podcast. I normally just scribble out some notes before I record, and it made me realise that a lot of feeding what we would call Marey mares is not about what we feed them so much. It's a lot about how we feed them. And also how what we feed them is affecting their gut health. So there's probably good opportunity to just take a big step back with your feeding program. If anyone has got a Marey mare that you are struggling to feed and struggling to deal with their behaviour, just take a big step back for a moment and let's have a look at their diet and their feeding and nutrition from a little bit of a zoomed out position. So yes, sometimes certain ingredients can affect them, and maybe there is certain ingredients that you should be avoiding. Maybe there is certain ingredients that you should be feeding. But I think feeding them needs to start from a place that's a little bit further back from that. And we need to start, as we do with all horses' diets, at what's the forage base of their diet look like? Because the forage in their diet is going to have a massive impact on their behaviour and their mental health, and also on their hormone production. So it's probably the biggest piece for me, at least, when thinking about feeding what we typically call Marey mares. Now, I love mares. I have 7 horses here and 6 of them are mares, and I absolutely adore them. We do have one that you would classify probably as being a Marey mare. She doesn't like being brushed. She doesn't like being fussed over. She doesn't particularly like the other horses being around her. She's one of the herd and she enjoys their company, but she would prefer to hang out with the one gelding than to have the other mares too close to her, and she will tell them if they are too close to her for sure. But she's not what I would classify in any way, shape or form a problematic mare. And in fact, she her nickname now is Circus Pony because my daughter's just competed in a big inter-schools event, and one of the funny things they do is a dress-up evening called Woof and Hoof, and I literally flew home from the event, dropped off the horse that she had been competing on that day back out to pasture and picked up popcorn, literally hosed the mud off her legs and gave her a bit of a hose down to tidy her up because Tomei hadn't ridden her for, weeks and weeks and weeks, and took her in to the event, and she gets all dressed up as a circus pony, and all of a sudden she's in the big ALEC arena here at Tamworth and jumping over funny little jumps in front of a crowd, and she was not an issue at all, and she's dead quiet. She just has got that mariness about her where she will tell you that she doesn't want you to brush her and things like that. But feeding them, I guess we just have to be careful not to get too up close and start messing around with individual ingredients before we have a look at their overall diet. So the very first thing I'd want you to think about when feeding a Marey mare is what is their hindgut health like? And what is their microbiome health like? Because that microbiome in that big old hindgut of theirs has got so much of an impact on their behaviour. So we have the gut-brain axis where the microbes in your horse's gut are communicating with your horse's brain. Those microbes are also producing lots of hormones and neurotransmitters, and one of the hormones that they produce an awful lot of is dopamine, which is obviously going to have an effect on behaviour. So you really, really need to be conscious of how what you're feeding is affecting their hindgut health and their hindgut microbiome health. So if you go back and have a listen to podcasts 9, 10 and 11, we have Dr. Belinda, our wonderful microbiologist, talking about all of the critters that live inside your horse's hindgut, and we also cover feeding for hindgut health and how to measure hindgut health. So you've got some real practical tools and tips there for assessing your Marey mare's hindgut health and just seeing where she's at. So, for example, if you tested her fecal pH and it was below 6.2, then there's something going on in her hindgut that you don't want to be going on in her hindgut, and I can say with near certainty that that will be affecting her behaviour. So that's the first place I would start, is have a look at the forage portion of the diet, have a really good think about and learn more about feeding to maintain hindgut health, and get that part of her diet pristine, as perfect as you can get it. Lots of forage, lots of different types of forage, and having forage accessible 24/7 are the three big rules there with getting her hindgut into really good shape. So once you have her hindgut in really good shape, you can be reasonably certain that she is going to have the microbes in there that will be producing B vitamins like vitamin B1, which will keep her in a normal state of calm. Horses with healthy hindguts have microbes that will produce a lot of vitamin B1 for them. So their normal state is to have plenty of vitamin B1 and then have the nice positive influence that that vitamin has on your horse's nervous system. You should also have the microbes in there that are producing the correct hormones for your mare. So things like dopamine that I've already mentioned that will have a big impact on her behaviour. The next place I would go is just having a look at what does her day look like. So if she is a mare that either spends long periods of time without something to chew on, or she is confined for long periods of time, so in a stable or a small yard, or she doesn't have the opportunity for interaction with other horses, all of these things can make, especially if they're intelligent mares. So my Marey mares I've had in my lifetime, they've always been really intelligent. And I think that part of the issue that some Marey mares have is they're bored and or they don't have anything to chew on. So we always need to remember that horses are wired to chew. And if they don't have something to chew on, that is not a natural state of being, and it's stressful for them and will create psychological stress, and then we know that psychological stress will then go on to create leaky gut, which will then set up systemic inflammation, and there's lots and lots of flow-on effects from that. But if you can give your Marey mare company, so company that she likes, have her with horses that she actually enjoys the company of, and have her moving, so have her able to be out and moving around with company, and as much as possible, make sure that she has something to chew on, so some forage to chew on, even if it's just straw. If she's a really good doer and you're having to manage her weight, make sure that she's always got something to chew on, because for mental health, it's number one for horses. They have to have something to chew, and it's always their happiest state when their head is down. Feed them close to the ground, head down and chewing. Be conscious of what your horse is spending her days doing. The next thing that might set a Marey mare off, because they typically are reasonably sensitive horses and they're probably very sensitive to pain, so if they get any form of gastric ulceration, they're probably going to react to that. So one thing you need to do, and this is a rule for all horses, not just for Marey mares, but be particularly conscious with Marey mares. When you go to ride your Marey mare, make sure you feed hay before you ride her. So I think it's podcast number 4 is feed lucerne hay before you ride. And it's so important to feed hay. If you can't feed lucerne or alfalfa before you ride, then any hay will do. But what the hay does, and you can listen to that podcast episode for the full details, but essentially what the hay does is put a lot of fibre in their stomach, and it also makes your mare create lots of saliva while she's chewing that fibre, and that saliva will dilute and buffer the gastric acid in her stomach. So the fibre in the stomach will stop the acid from splashing up to the top part of the stomach and burning holes through her stomach while you're riding her, and the saliva makes the fluid in the stomach less acidic. So even if a little bit of it does splash, it's less likely to burn holes. So with your Marey mares, make sure, please, when you go to ride them, that their stomachs are full of fibre. Lucerne hay is best because it's a natural buffer itself, but if you don't or can't feed lucerne hay for any reason, then any hay will do. But just while you're saddling them up, put hay in front of them. A went for a 5-day ride through the Kosciuszko Mountains in southern New South Wales in April earlier this year with my partner Ryan. And oh God, it was just so stunning. And the horses on this ride were just so beautiful. And I had this gorgeous big warm blood mare. Her name was Jats. And the ride operators said to me that Jats is wonderful, and Jats was wonderful. Jats doesn't really like people. And the first morning that I saddled her up, man, she wanted to eat me alive. And I literally had to hold her right at the halter to brush her because she was turning around and trying to nip me, and she was lifting her leg when I was brushing under her belly. She just wasn't enjoying being brushed. And I said to the ride operators, have you thought about having hay out for the horses while they're being saddled up? Because, well, one, it distracts them, and I think if you can keep them distracted and happy eating, then it's just a much nicer experience for everyone while you're saddling up. And two, I didn't know how much of that behaviour she was exhibiting was because of pain in her stomach. If she was a little bit ulcerated, which for horses that work hard over long periods of time, like these trail horses, it's entirely possible that they will get ulcerated over time. Anyway, the next day they said to me, you can give her some lucerne hay if you like while you're saddling up. I'm like, oh, beauty. Made me feel so much better. So I went and got some lucerne hay for her and also for her friend Jester, who was Ryan's horse, and they stood there, and honestly she was as happy as anything, and Brad was sort of standing back and watching as I saddled up, and he said to me a little bit later, he goes, "Did make a difference, didn't it?" He said, "I was watching it and she was definitely different." And I said, "Oh, a completely different horse. She there was no ears back, there was no lifting her leg. She was just had her nose down on the ground eating hay while I saddled her up." And it was beautiful because later on in that ride, maybe I think it was the 4th day, and I was really conscious with her. They were wonderful. They said every time we stopped, let them eat. So, and there was lots of grass on the ground. So every time we stopped, we made sure they ate. And at lunchtime, I never tied her up. I made sure, because I'm so paranoid about gastric ulcers as a nutritionist, but she was always out eating, and any little chance I get, I would put her in a position where she had access to the best grass that I could find for her in the spot that we were in. And we were on a big rocky outcrop they called it Shark Rock because it looked like a shark fin, and they were taking photos of us, and they were sort of flapping something. I can't remember what it was, someone's empty sandwich bag or something, flapping something to get the horses to put their ears forward. And she was just happily putting her ears forward, and they made comment that that's the happiest she'd been that entire season. And we were their last ride of the season. So it was really nice, I guess, reinforcement for me that when you look after these mares, get plenty of fibre into them, and make sure that they're comfortable in their stomach, then often they will be a lot happier because they're not in pain. And like I said, they're often incredibly intelligent. She was a really smart mare. They are often incredibly intelligent mares, and I think that also makes them quite sensitive. So any little bit of pain, and you will get more of that Marey sort of behaviour. I'm not sure when I say Marey behaviour, the ears back and the kind of grouchy, don't touch me, I don't want you anywhere near me, not so much the, prolonged being in season and things like that. That's potentially a whole other issue that needs looking into from a veterinary perspective. So the next thing to be conscious of is whether there might be anything in their diet from a toxin perspective that might set them off. So something like the mycotoxin zearalenone, which is quite common in corn-based feeds. You can find it in other feed ingredients as well, but it is really common in corn. It messes with their hormones. So it's a disaster when it comes to actual reproduction, but it does really mess with female hormones. So if you're travelling on along okay with a mare, and then all of a sudden you're getting Marey behaviour and you can't understand where it's coming from, then do consider that maybe you've got mycotoxin contamination in your feed, and it would be worth testing, especially if you change batches of feed and then that behaviour started. You can test for zearalenone and a bunch of other mycotoxins relatively easily. It's not super cheap. It's a few $100s to get a mycotoxin screen done, but you can definitely test. You can also check with your feed manufacturer whether they're testing the grain. They should be. but they won't necessarily be. So it is best practice to test, but not every feed manufacturer will test. But it would be worth asking the question if you're struggling with a mare, whether there is any testing protocol at the feed company that makes the feed that you use if you're using a feed for your horse. And then I'm going to add a little bit of a woo one in here, just because I firmly believe, and I think we all know as horse owners, it's not so woo really, but we all know that horses will mirror our own energy back to us. So if you do have a mare, it's worth just pausing to think about your own energy and what's going on for you and how you're feeling when you're around your mare, and whether you may be both setting each other off. I had the really cool experience of dramatically changing my life for the better. And I just watched my horses going from these, feed time was stressful, and there was only 2 of them. But they would come in and they'd run through gates in the yards that I used to feed them in, and they'd end up in the wrong place, and then I'd try to move them to the right place, and they'd both run off, and they were anxious horses. I had to have, I didn't have to have one of them sedated, but we had their teeth done. And while Popcorn was still sedated from having her teeth done, right, I'm going to brush her mane. This is the mare that we have now, going to brush her mane, because she hated her mane being brushed so much that I simply could not brush her mane. And then, big life changes, and I moved, and I can feed 7 horses now in 2 paddocks, and they will all just stand there and eat from their own feed bins. And it's just really peaceful and lovely, and that anxiety and fractiousness that they used to display has gone. I mean, they'll still stick their tail in the air and run around if something scares them and things like that. But as a rule, 95% of the time they'll come up to eat, and they're just calm, and they'll stand and just wait for their feed, and they all know which feed bin is theirs, and they also know that they're not allowed to go and eat out of anyone else's feed bin. The gelding is really the only one that will break the rules and go and do that. But it's just, I guess, a mention there just to be aware of your own energy and to have a little bit of a ponder on whether the behaviour you're seeing in your mare is perhaps a reflection of your own internal landscape. Just something to ponder. And then the last little aspect of feeding mares that I want to cover is actually the ingredients. So is there things that we should be feeding these horses, and is there things that we shouldn't be feeding their horses? Is there ingredients that will set them off? And there potentially is. So I've been a professional nutritionist for 25 years now. And I couldn't tell you how many horses I have worked with over the years, but it's many, many, many thousands of horses. And I can remember maybe 3 distinct cases, and I couldn't tell you whether they were all mares now, but 3 distinct cases where if these particular horses had alfalfa or lucerne, their behaviour was almost uncontrollable. Their behaviour changed so dramatically when they would have lucerne. So it's not, you'll hear people say, lucerne makes horses hyperactive. Well, in most cases, it's just that lucerne is very high in energy compared to most grassy forages. And if you feed a horse a lot of lucerne, then it will be on a high energy diet. And the change in behaviour you are seeing is just this uptick in energy in their diet. But the 3 horses I'm thinking of, their behaviour was completely out of character. So they would get aggressive, or they'd just impossible to ride. And it was narrowed down to, if they had any lucerne in their diet, then their behaviour changed. And I've never ever gotten to the bottom of what caused that. But it's always made me wonder. I have 3 brothers, and one of my brothers, the one younger than me, when he was a kid, if he ate any food with natural salicylate in it, he was the same. He would literally kick holes through walls because he was like a tornado. And it was things like tomatoes and grapes and watermelon. So healthy foods, things that you would consider to be healthy for kids to eat. But if he ate any of those foods, his behaviour he was a gorgeous, normal kid when he wasn't eating any of those foods. And then if he did have those foods, his behaviour would just switch. and he would become a tornado. And lucerne is really high in salicylate. And it's always made me wonder, like, I wonder if these horses are reacting in a similar way. And I don't know how you'd actually figure that out. I guess you could, that was too many years ago now to go back and do that, but I guess you could feed them some natural salicylate in another form and see if you got the same behaviour. But if you notice that your horse is behaving dramatically differently on any ingredient, then take that ingredient out of the diet and assess their behaviour. And then if you game, put that ingredient back in the diet and see if consistently you get that same behaviour again. So it can happen that horses will react to certain ingredients, but it's uncommon. A lot of people with Marey mares will want to avoid soybean, but honestly, again, yes, it's possible, and I would definitely recommend if you've got a Marey mare and you've done everything else that we've talked about, make sure that her hindgut health is pristine and that she has got good gut-brain axis communication and getting all the proper hormones out of the hindgut that she should be getting. You're making sure she's got forage to chew on all the time. You're making sure she's got plenty of hay to eat before you ride. That it wasn't a change in a batch of feed that set her behaviour off with a mycotoxin. If you've done all of those things and you're still not getting on top of her Marey behaviour, then it is worth going through and taking individual ingredients out of diets to see if you can notice any effect. So one mare does come to mind that did definitely react to soybean. So they do exist, but again, they're uncommon. Like I can only recall one mare that was a really distinct sensitivity or bad behavioural reaction to soybean, and she would stand there and like kick holes through her stable wall and just kick and kick and kick in her stable, and yet if we took soybean out of her diet, that behaviour went away. So definitely it can happen, but don't let it be the first thing you go to try and figure out what's going on for these horses, because you might be trying to take out all of these things in the diet to narrow down what the problem is, and the problem might just be that the forage amount and forage diversity in her diet is not supporting a healthy microbiome, and then her gut-brain axis is all messed up and her hormone production, microbial hormone production is all messed up, and that's what's setting her behaviour off. So don't go to it must be one of the ingredients in her diet that's the problem is the first place you go to. Make sure everything else is in place, and then if you still can't get on top of your behaviour, her behaviour, then start to look at individual ingredients. And just you can do ingredient testing in a few ways. You can take everything but her forage out of the diet and then gradually one by one add each ingredient back in again. So if you're feeding a complete feed that has soybean as a component, you might need to, for a period of time, stop feeding the complete feed and just take as much as you can out of the diet, leaving plenty of forage and plenty of variety of forage in there. And then just one by one introduce the ingredients that are in the feed. So for example, if you were feeding a feed that had like if it was a sweet feed that had some oats, some barley, some corn, some soybean and some lupins, you take the complete feed out and then add each of those ingredients in individually to see if any of them are setting her off. Or you can do it the other way around. If you're already mixing your own complete feed, you might just take one ingredient out. So say, for example, you are mixing up like I do for a lay, our off-the-track thoroughbred. She gets a feed that has got a balancer pellet in it, and it's also she gets lupins and sugar beet pulp and copper meal and full fat soybean. So if I was wanting to see, she displays virtually no Marey behaviour. She's the biggest, most gentlest, gorgeous soul. But if she was displaying Marey behaviour and I knew like her diet is very, very forage based, big variety of forage, her hindgut health should be very good. We're about to test her microbiome, so I'll be able to tell you for sure, or not soon. But the first thing I would do is take the full fat soybean out of that diet for a period of 2 weeks or more, just to see if that might be what, if she was displaying Marey behaviour, if that was what was causing her Marey behaviour. Be aware that mares are almost constantly cycling through their reproductive phases. So You will get them, when they're on heat, their Marey behaviour is going to be exaggerated versus when they're not on heat and they're typically a little bit more settled. So do just be, if you're assessing the effect of an ingredient, if you're doing it where you're putting ingredients in, just be mindful if you put an ingredient in right when they come on heat, you will see a change in behaviour, but it's probably got nothing to do with the ingredient. So it's probably worth leaving each ingredient for a month between adding the next one, or if you're doing it in the reverse and taking things out, take it out, leave it out for a month and just see whether or not it is having an impact on her behaviour. It would be remiss of me not to mention with Marey mares that pain is often a factor. So you need to rule out any kind of pain. So pain in their hooves, pain in their reproductive organs for any reason. All sorts of weird and funky things can happen with their reproductive tract that it needs a veterinarian to assess and to rule out any pain that might be going on there for her. Even just saddle fit. So Tamaya's Popcorn, the circus pony, was being ridden in a saddle, and this is absolutely my bad, but being ridden in a saddle that did not fit her well, and she was getting to the point where she was not letting Tamaya hop on her. I was like, oh, no, this is more out of character Marey than what she normally is, and yeah, get a new saddle, properly saddle fitted, and the one she was being ridden in was the saddle fitter called it antique, which I tried not to be offended over because it was my saddle when I was a kid, but it was not a saddle that you could change the gullet in, so we got a properly fitted saddle for her, and my goodness, the change in her behaviour just with that. They're so sensitive, these mares. They're so smart, and they will tell you when they're hurting. Or try to tell you, and they can't speak so often. They have to just try and tell us through their behaviour. So that probably comes even above making sure that their hindgut is okay and you've got plenty of forage and fibre diversity in their diet. Rule out pain first, because it will set off their behaviour. So I hope that helps a little bit. Good luck with your mares. They are just the most beautiful creatures. They will try their hearts out for you. And it really comes back to the very first podcast episode where I talk about feed your horse like a horse. It really comes back to that, like really honour their gastrointestinal tract, feed them the way that their gastrointestinal tract is designed to be fed. And that's typically when you'll get your calmest, most beautiful behaviour. So really back to basics, lots of forage, big variety of forage, and be really conscious of the amount of hard feed you're feeding them, and if it comes down to it, what's in that hard feed. And so super important to feed them hay before you ride, because if there's any pain there, they will be sure to tell you. Anyway, I love my mares, and I love all my fellow mare lovers. Sometimes I try to divide horse people into two categories, and I think one lot of two categories is people who love mares and people who don't. But yeah, for anyone else who loves mares, I understand, because they're just the most wonderful horses in my opinion. Hope that helps, and thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse virtual equine nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also, while you're there, check out the Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.